My neighbor, the self-crowned ruler of pristine lawns and ironclad rules, decided to launch a full-on assault on my hard-earned peace and quiet, all because of my boat. That $500 fine for just using my own dock felt like a punchline to a cruel joke, but for her, it was just another Monday power trip. I snagged this lake cabin as my sanctuary, not a playground for meddling HOA tyrants who act like they own the water itself. This wasn't some petty squabble, it was the opening shot in a wild neighborhood saga set to turn Harmony Heights upside down. If you've ever crossed paths with someone who thinks their word is gospel, you'll feel this in your bones. What's the wildest stunt your HOA ever pulled? Drop it in the comments. I'm not alone in this madness. My name's Trevor Simmons, 32 years old, a land reclamation specialist who helps folks transform old farmland into something new. The job pays decently, enough to land me this lake cabin on Lake Harmony, a quirky 1970s relic with wood paneling and shag carpet, but it came with a gem, a private dock stretching 30 feet into crystal clear water. That dock was my lifeline, my escape from soil samples and environmental reports all week long. The morning it all unraveled started peaceful. I was on my deck, coffee in hand, watching ducks glide by as morning mist danced off the water, the air thick with the scent of pine and fresh lake. And which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any run-ins with your HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. Scent that makes city folks drive hours just to breathe. I just finished pumping up my little inflatable fishing boat when I noticed something white fluttering on my door. First thought, maybe pizza delivery finally reached the lake instead. I found an official document with Harmony Heights Homeowners Association letterhead. The words jumped off the page: violation notice, unauthorized dock usage, fine $500. I read it 3 times before. The absurdity hit me. According to this notice, I was illegally using HOA property by docking my boat at what they claimed was their dock. The letter was signed with an elaborate flourish. Brianna Whitaker, HOA president, standing there with that violation notice. My mind drifted back to the first time I'd seen this place. The cabin needed work. But when we walked down to that dock, everything else faded away. It wasn't just a platform, it was a bridge between land and my dreams. That dock was my sanctuary, representing the freedom and peace I'd worked for. Now some bureaucrat was trying to steal it with a piece of paper. I've dealt with bureaucratic nonsense in my work, from environmental regulations to zoning laws that require forms to get forms. But this felt personal. I marched to my filing cabinet and pulled out my property deed, the document I'd studied before buying, right there, in black and white dock structure, extending 30 FT into Lake Harmony, waters constructed 1978. The dock had been part of the original property for almost 50 years. The cabin itself sat on a gentle slope that rolled down to the water's edge, surrounded by towering pines that filtered sunlight into dancing patterns across the weathered deck. Inside, the place had that comfortable, lived-in feeling of a true retreat, with a stone fireplace that had warmed countless evening conversations and windows positioned to frame the alike living artwork. This wasn't just a weekend getaway, it was a piece of paradise that someone was trying to destroy with petty power games. I was standing there with deed in one hand and violation notice in the other when I heard high heels clicking on wooden planks through my window. I could see her approaching, like a general inspecting enemy territory. Brianna Whitaker was impossible to miss, dressed in a business suit that costs more than most people's monthly mortgage. Her blonde hair was salon perfect, and she clutched a thick binder labeled Perfect Neighborhood. Standards in gold lettering. "Excuse me," she called in a voice sharp enough to cut fog. You need to remove that boat immediately. This is community property and you're in violation of Section 12B of the homeowners agreement. I stepped outside with my deed up close. She had that politician's smile, all teeth and no warmth, actually, I said, holding up my deed. This dock is part of my property, has been since 1978, according to county records. For a moment, I saw surprise flicker across her face, then doubt, but it vanished quickly. That's impossible, she said, voice losing authority. The HOA has maintained this dock for years. We've repainted it twice. Replaced planking in 2020. You can't claim ownership of community assets we've invested thousands in maintaining. She flipped through her binder. Frantically, I smiled at the irony. Well, if the HOA spent money maintaining my dock, I should thank you. Saved me several thousand. The look she gave me could have frozen the lake. She snapped her binder shut and pulled out her phone, typing furiously. You'll be hearing from us, she said, heels clicking angrily as she marched back down my dock. The Harmony Heights HOA doesn't tolerate troublemakers. And just like that, she was gone, leaving expensive perfume and the promise of war. That evening I called Tina Mitchell, a freelance journalist who investigated HOA corruption. Trevor, she said, after I explained everything, you've stepped into a war zone. Brianna Whitaker has been terrorizing that neighborhood for 3 years. I've been waiting for someone with backbone to fight back. Tina's research confirmed what I knew. The dock was mine legally and completely armed with this. I drafted a firm letter to the HOA explaining I wouldn't pay the fine and requesting they remove the violation. I thought that would end it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I woke to discover my boat floating in the middle of Lake Harmony, like lost debris bobbing 200 YED from shore. The morning was still with that glassy surface that makes every sound carry. My boat looked absurdly out of place in all that empty water. Maybe the lines had failed, or a passing boat created enough wake to snap them. But when I reached my dock, the truth was more sinister. The mooring lines hadn't failed or frayed. They'd been cut clean through with something sharp, leaving perfectly straight edges that screamed, "Deliberate sabotage." My blood pressure spiked as I held the severed ropes. Brianna wasn't just a bureaucratic nuisance. She was willing to commit crimes to get her way. I grabbed my backup kayak and paddled out to retrieve my property. October water could freeze your bones, but I was too angry to care. The lake stretched endlessly around me. Mirror calm, this solitude usually brought me peace, but today it only amplified my rage at whoever had violated my sanctuary. Halfway back, towing the boat, behind my kayak, I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a 6-inch gash in the side, right below the waterline. Someone hadn't just cut my lines. As a warning, they damaged my property in a way that could have been dangerous if I had been on the water. I spent the morning documenting everything with the thoroughness my work had taught me. I photographed the cut lines from multiple angles, measured the boat damage, and wrote down exact times and observations. The repair cost came to $200, money stolen from my pocket by someone who thought they could bully me into submission. But sitting in the marine repair shop, watching the technician patch my boat, I had an idea. If Brianna wanted to play games with my property, I'd make sure I had evidence. Next time, I stopped by the electronics store and picked up a small GPS tracker, waterproof and able to run for weeks on a single charge. That evening, after my boat was repaired, I carefully concealed the tracker inside the storage compartment. If someone messed with my boat again, I'd know exactly where it went and when. Before installing the tracker, I called my old college roommate Mike, who now worked as a corporate security consultant in the city. Trevor. He laughed after I explained. The situation, you're dealing with a classic small-time dictator who's drunk on power. These HOA types are all the same. They think a little authority makes them untouchable. But here's the thing about bullies. They always escalate until someone makes them stop document everything, stay one step ahead, and eventually they'll hang themselves with their own rope. Just don't let them drive you crazy in the process. Mike's advice was solid, but he hadn't seen the look in Brianna's eyes when she realized I wasn't going to roll over. This wasn't just about power. It felt personal, like she'd made destroying me her mission in life. 2 nights later, around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with an alert. My boat was moving. I pulled up the real-time map and watched a blue dot trace a deliberate path from my dock to the far side of the lake, where it stopped near the HOA's community pond. I grabbed binoculars and stepped onto my deck, but the distance was too great to see details in the darkness. The next morning brought vindication. Beyond my expectations, I found my boat tied to a fallen tree on the opposite shore, another 200 wide from my dock. No additional damage this time, but the message was clear: stay in line or we'll keep making your life difficult. What they didn't realize was that my GPS tracker had recorded everything in digital detail that would hold up in court. I had precise coordinates showing my boat's exact path, timestamps proving when each movement occurred, and speed, data proving human intervention. The tracker had even recorded a 15-minute stop directly adjacent to the community pond. I shared this evidence with Tina, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "Trevor, this is gold." She said, "What they're doing is criminal vandalism, trespassing, possibly theft. We need to document everything and build a case." She helped me draft another letter, including GPS data printouts and a formal complaint about escalating harassment that evening. My neighbor Thomas Reynolds knocked on my door with beer and a story that made my blood boil. Thomas was a retired plumber in his 50s who'd lived on the lake over a decade. "Trevor," he said, settling into my deck chair, "I've been watching what Brianna is doing to you, and it's not right. But you should know you're not the first." Thomas told me about the Martinez family forced to sell their cabin the previous year after Brianna hit them with violation after violation. Their crime painting, their front door a shade of blue. Not on the approved color list, the fines started small but escalated until the family couldn't afford to fight. "She bled them dry," Thomas said, gripping his beer bottle, "made their lives so miserable they had no choice." But to sell and move away as Thomas talked, I found myself tapping fingers on the table, a habit. When thinking through complex problems, the pattern was clear. Brianna wasn't just power-hungry, she was a predator, targeting people she thought couldn't fight back. The Martinez family had been vulnerable as newcomers who didn't understand their rights. She probably thought I'd be another easy target that night. I sat on my deck, staring at the lake. The water was mirror smooth, reflecting stars like scattered diamonds usually. This calmed my nerves, but tonight all I could think about was justice, and the growing certainty that Brianna had picked the wrong person to mess with the unauthorized surveillance fine was Brianna's attempt to escalate our conflict, but it was also her first serious mistake in her eagerness to punish me for gathering evidence. She'd revealed something crucial. She was scared and acting defensively. People confident in their position don't lash out with thousandy fines over GPS trackers on someone else's property. I sent all evidence to Tina along with a formal letter demanding legal justification for their escalating harassment. Tina helped research legal precedents, and we discovered HOAs have far less power than they like people to believe. Especially regarding activities on private property, Brianna's response came as a certified letter threatening legal action for invasion of privacy and unauthorized surveillance of community assets. The letter used dense legal language designed to intimidate, full of phrases like actionable offences and monetary damages that sounded impressive, but had no real meaning. When tracking my own property, I was reading Brianna's threats for the third time when Tina called with information that changed everything. "Trevor," she said, voice crackling with excitement, "I've been digging into the HOA's financial records. Want to guess who actually owns that community pond Brianna treats like her personal kingdom? The community pond was Brianna's crown jewel, a pristine 2-acre water feature. She'd spent years perfecting. She'd installed decorative fountains, planted ornamental grasses, and stocked it with expensive, coyish neighbors often saw her by the pond at sunrise, checking her perfect neighborhood standards. Binder. As I walked the perimeter, I noticed small brass plaques, memorial garden reflection area, educational nature display. Every square foot was planned and labeled, turning it into something sterile and controlled, far from naturally beautiful. That's when the idea hit like lightning. I'd spent years working with farmers and ranchers, helping reclaim damaged land for livestock operations. I knew exactly what permits were needed for livestock facilities, and I had all the contacts to make. It happened quickly and legally, more importantly. I had access to something that would make Brianna's perfect neighborhood miserable cattle that loved wallowing in mud. In my line of work, I'd seen how controlled livestock grazing could actually improve ecosystem health, breaking up compacted soil, and creating diverse habitats that sterile landscaping could never match. What Brianna saw as perfection, I saw as an opportunity to create something genuinely beneficial to the environment, while simultaneously destroying her symbol of control. I spent 2 days researching the property listing and running numbers. The pond was outside HOA jurisdiction for zoning, meaning once I owned it, they'd have no authority to stop me using it. However I wanted, the land was already zoned. Agricultural and livestock operations were specifically permitted with basic environmental guidelines I could easily meet. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it became. Brianna had spent years turning that pond into her symbol of suburban superiority. She held HOA meetings. They brought prospective buyers to showcase amenities, had professional photos taken for marketing materials. Destroying that symbol would cut the heart out of her power structure. I called Thomas that evening. "I need to borrow $50. "0, I said without preamble. "I want to buy the HOA's pond and turn it into a cattle operation that will make Brianna's life miserable while staying completely legal." Long pause, then deep laughter. Trevor Thomas said, "That's the most beautiful revenge plan I've ever heard. When do you need the money?" Thomas had been saving for cabin renovations, but was willing to lend me the cash to take down Queen Brianna. "She's made this neighborhood miserable too long," he said, as we shook hands. "Besides, I've always wanted to see what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object." The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and filed paperwork to purchase the pond property. The process took less than 2 hours. By noon, I owned Brianna's most treasured community asset. Best part: the sale wouldn't be public record for 72 hours, giving me 3 days to implement my plan before she discovered what happened. I spent those days making calls and arranging deliveries. First, I contacted excavation companies to modify the pond's drainage. Then I called farmers I'd worked with and arranged to lease a dozen head of cattle. By Thursday morning, everything was in place for the transformation of Brianna's crown jewel into something she'd never recover from seeing. By Thursday morning, my plan was ready to launch. With military precision, the excavation crew arrived before dawn and systematically dismantled everything Brianna had spent years creating. The decorative fountains were carefully removed and stored ornamental grasses relocated, and expensive coyish transferred to a wildlife preserve. What remained was a muddy depression, 50 yards across and 5 FT deep at the center. Perfect. For my purposes, the transformation required more work than I'd initially anticipated, but my background in land reclamation served me well. I supervised the installation of a proper drainage system that would maintain water circulation while creating the muddy conditions cattle needed for cooling and pest control. We built sturdy rail fencing around the entire perimeter, not just to contain the animals, but to clearly mark the boundaries of my private property. The gates were positioned for easy access to feed and water the cattle, and I had the crew install a small shelter on one side where the animals could escape harsh weather. Every detail was planned with both functionality and spite in mind. This wasn't just going to be a mud pit. It was going to be a professional livestock operation that happened to destroy Brianna's vision of suburban perfection. My friend Jake Morrison, a cattle rancher, 30 me out, arrived that afternoon with a trailer full of Holeen dairy cows, perfectly suited for what I planned. These weren't prize animals, but healthy, well-socialized cattle used to standing in mud, and wouldn't mind the change from traditional pasture to what Jake called the world's most expensive cattle spot as we unloaded the cattle and watched them explore their new home. Word was already spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. I could see neighbors gathering in small groups along the road, some pointing and laughing, others looking shocked and dismayed. Cy Patterson from 2 streets over stood with her hands on her hips, shaking her head in obvious disapproval. The young couple who'd just moved in last month seemed more curious than angry, taking pictures with their phones like tourists at an exotic attraction. Old Mr. Henderson, who'd been fighting his own battles with the HOA over his vegetable garden, gave me a thumbs up and a knowing grin that suggested he understood exactly what I was doing and why the reactions were as divided as I'd expected. But at least people were paying attention, and that was exactly what I wanted. I was standing by my newly acquired mud pit, watching a dozen black and white cows explore their new home, when I heard a car door slam with extreme force. Through the trees I could see a familiar figure in an expensive business suit marching toward me with a thick folder clutched like armor. Brianna had discovered her precious pond was gone. The look on Brianna's face when she saw what had become of her crowned jewel was worth every penny of Thomas's $50. 0. She stood where crystal clearer water once reflected ornamental grasses, staring at Holstein cows contentedly wallowing in 3 FT of brown mud. The barnyard aroma hit her first, that unmistakable combination of mud manure and wet cattle, and I watched her face wrinkle in disgust. "What?" she said, in a voice that could shatter glass. "Have you done to my pond?" She wore another expensive suit, cream-colored fabric, that probably cost more than most monthly mortgages. Her perfect neighborhood standards binder was clutched like a shield, and her perfect hair was already frizzing in humidity rising from the mud pit. I leaned against the new fence Jake had helped install. "It's not your pond anymore," I said, enjoying her obvious distress. "As of Tuesday afternoon, this is private property, and these ladies," I gestured toward the cows, "are my new business partners." Rihanna's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish gasping. "Finally!" She found her voice several octaves higher than usual. "This is impossible. The HOA owns this pond. We've maintained it for years, spent thousands on improvements. You can't steal community property." "I didn't steal anything," I said, pulling out the official property deed. "I bought it fair and square. Turns out your HOA was so broke, they had to sell their crown jewel to pay bills. Funny how they forgot." Mentioning that at community meetings, color drained from her face as she read the paperwork. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how this happened without her knowledge. What she didn't realize was the HOA board had voted to sell during an emergency session she'd missed for her monthly spa appointment. "This is vandalism," she said, voice rising to a pitch that made the nearest cow look up. "You've destroyed a beautiful community asset and turned it into a disgusting cesspit. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," I said, genuinely, hoping she would. "While you're at it, ask them about criminal penalties for tampering with someone else's property. I have GPS data proving you've been messing with my boat for weeks that stopped her cold." She knew she'd been caught, and for the first time, Queen Brianna looked genuinely scared over the next hours. Words spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Small groups gathered at my property edge, some laughing at the cows, others shaking heads in dismay. The sound carried across water too, that distinctive lowing, meaning dinner time, and I could see lights in cabins that had never worried about barnyard noises. Thomas stopped by with beer and a grin stretching ear to ear. "Trevor," he said, setting up a chair with perfect mud pit view, "this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Brianna spent 40 minutes in her driveway this afternoon, just staring at your cows and hyperventilating." The real test came next morning, when I walked out to feed cattle and found a crowd by the fence. Some looked angry, sharing Brienne's opinion that I'd destroyed something beautiful, but others seemed curious about the cows, and a few were laughing at the absurdity that afternoon. "Tina arrived with a television camera crew. Trevor," she said, barely containing excitement. "I pitched this as David versus Goliath about HOA overreach, and they want a feature segment ready to be famous." The interview was surreal. I found myself explaining to a reporter why I'd bought a community pond and filled it with cattle, while the cows provided perfect background entertainment, mooing at exactly the right moments like professional actors. "This isn't about revenge," I told the reporter, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. "This is about property rights and the principle that HOAs can't bully people into submission. I legally purchased this land, and I'm using it for its designated agricultural purpose." The local news story transformed my cattle operation from neighborhood curiosity into regional sensation. By 8 the morning after it aired, cars with out-of-state plates lined the main road, and people walked to my fence with cameras taking pictures. Like my cows were exotic zoo animals, my mud pit had become an overnight tourist destination. The attention was hilarious and mildly overwhelming. I'd expected local interest, maybe neighbors stopping by, but not becoming center of a regional story about property rights that resonated with people who'd battled overzealous HOA. My phone rang constantly with reporters wanting interviews and legal advocacy groups offering help. It seemed my unique brand of defiance had struck a nerve across the country, turning me into an unlikely folk hero for anyone fed up with petty bureaucracy. The sheer volume of supportive messages, emails, and even postcards was astounding, a testament to the universal frustration people felt towards overbearing authority figures. Around 10 that morning, a minivan pulled up, and a family of 5 climbed out, the parents looking excited while 3 kids bounced with energy. "Excuse me," the father called out, approaching my fence with a camera. "Are you the cow guy from TV? My kids saw the story and begged us to drive out here." The mother was already taking pictures while their youngest, maybe 6 years old, pressed his face against the fence rails. "Moo," the little boy called to my cattle, and I swear one of the Holings actually looked up and responded with a gentle lowing that sent the kid into delighted giggles. "Can we pet them?" the daughter asked, maybe 10 years old, with pigtails. "They're working animals, sweetie," I explained, "but you can watch them splash." In the mud for the next 20 minutes, I found myself giving an impromptu tour of my operation, explaining how cattle help manage land and why they love wallowing in mud. The parents asked thoughtful questions about environmental benefits, while the kids just enjoyed watching thousand peas act like they were at a spa. But real entertainment was watching Brianna's reaction to media attention. She'd organized a community response demonstration consisting of herself, 5 neighbors, and handmade signs, reading "Respect our community" and "Stop the madness." They'd positioned their protest at my property edge close enough that barnyard smell made several protesters look uncomfortable. I stood on my deck with morning coffee watching protesters and tourists coexist while my cows provided entertainment for both groups. Thomas appeared with his own coffee and newspaper. "Trevor," he said, "enjoying the chaos? You've started something beautiful." Brianna's been up since 5, was calling every news station, trying to get follow-up stories about how you're destroying the neighborhood. Her attempts to control the narrative were as transparent as her expensive suit and equally ineffective. She genuinely believed her outrage would sway public opinion, utterly oblivious to how absurd she appeared. Standing there in her designer clothes, amidst cow manure, decrying my destruction of a pond she didn't even legally own. The newspaper featured my story on the local section front page with a photo of me by the fence while a cow posed photogenically in the background. The headline read, "Local man turns HOA dispute into cattle operation." And the article was surprisingly balanced, presenting both sides while making clear I'd acted within legal day. Right around noon, a second TV crew arrived from a regional network specializing in human interest stories. They set up next to Brianna's protest, meaning every shot included at least one protester in background. The visual irony was perfect, angry. Neighbors demanding community respect while standing next to a perfectly legal agricultural operation. The regional reporter was more aggressive, asking pointed questions about motivations and property value impact. But she also interviewed supporters, including Thomas and neighbors tired of Brianna's authoritarian approach. "This neighborhood's been divided for years," Thomas told the reporter, while Brianna glared from 20 FT away. "There are people who think the HOA should control every aspect of our lives, and people who want to be left alone. Trevor's just the first with courage to fight back." The interview, that really made the story, was when the reporter cornered Brianna near her protest signs. What I found fascinating was watching the camera crew's reaction as they filmed her. The cameraman kept exchanging glances with the sound technician, subtle eye rolls that suggested they'd encountered this type of self-impertinent HOA president before. When Brianna demanded they stop filming because she didn't like the angle, the reporter's smile became noticeably more forced. "Ma'am, we're on public property," the reporter said, with professional patience that barely concealed her irritation. The lighting assistant actually snorted when Brianna insisted they reshoot her opening statement because a cow had moved in the background, claiming it was deliberately disruptive. By the time they finished the entire news, crew looked like they'd rather be covering a sewage plant explosion than dealing with Queen Brianna's media demands. I watched as Brianna tried explaining her position, voice getting higher and more strained, while my cows provided a mooing soundtrack. "This man has deliberately destroyed a beautiful community asset," she said, gesturing toward the mud pit where 3 cows enjoyed their wall. "He's turned our neighborhood into a barnyard out of spite." "But isn't it true," the reporter pressed, "that Mr. Simmons legally purchased this property from the HOA and that it's zoned for agricultural use?" That's when Brianna's composure cracked. "Legal doesn't mean right," she shouted loud enough that tourists stopped photographing cows to stare. "He's doing this to hurt me personally, and everyone knows it. This is harassment, pure and simple." The reporter pressed further. "Are you saying property owners shouldn't use their land as they see fit, following local zoning laws?" Brianna's response was exactly what Tina hoped for. Some people, she said, voiced dripping disdain, don't understand that community living means making sacrifices for the greater good. They think property rights mean doing whatever they want regardless of neighbors. Her tirade was a masterclass in self-incrimination. Broadcast live for all to see, she truly believed her personal affront outweighed legal rights and community well-being, solidifying her image as the tyrannical villain in this unfolding drama. The public, always eager for a good David versus Goliath story, had found their new favorite villain. That soundbite made evening news on 3 stations and was picked up by cable networks specializing in quirky stories. By next morning, family across the country were texting me about seeing me on television with my cows. But real vindication came when Tina called with news that changed everything. "Trevor," she said, crackling with excitement, "I've been digging deeper into HOA finances. Remember those emergency meetings where they voted to sell the pond? Guess who wasn't properly notified, even though they had legal right to attend? Brianna had been violating HOA procedures for years. The pond sale happened during improperly announced meetings, and Tina had discovered financial irregularities, suggesting Brianna used HOA funds for personal expenses. I found receipts for over $20,000 in charges to the HOA account," Tina continued. "Spa treatments, expensive dinners, even a resort weekend," she claimed, "was a leadership conference. The woman's been embezzling from her neighbors." This explained how the HOA got so broke they had to sell their crown jewel. Brianna hadn't just been tyrannical, she'd been systematically looting the treasury. The evidence of Brianna's financial misconduct was damning, but Tina wanted to verify everything before going public. With embezzlement accusations, she spent 3 days cross-referencing bank records, with meeting minutes, tracking receipts, and building an airtight case even expensive lawyers couldn't dismiss. We discovered systematic financial abuse going back 2 years. HOA money had flowed into Brianna's personal accounts like water through. A broken dam, spa treatments billed as stress management for leadership. Expensive dinners charged as stakeholder meetings, even a $5. Zero resort weekend claimed as professional development. Despite bringing her husband Brad for golf and massages, the smoking gun was payments to a law firm supposedly handling community disputes. When Tina contacted them directly, they confirmed they'd never worked for Harmony Heights HOA. The payments totaling $15,000 went to a shell company Brianna created using the HOA's taxi T. "She's not just incompetent," Tina said. "During our strategy meeting, she's a criminal who's been stealing from neighbors while lecturing about fiscal responsibility. We could go to police, but financial crimes take forever to prosecute, or we go public and let community pressure force her out. I favored public exposure. I wanted justice, swift and visible, to the community that had suffered under her leadership. We decided to present evidence at the next HOA meeting scheduled for Tuesday evening weekend. Before I noticed significant neighborhood dynamic changes as word spread about upcoming revelations, people chose sides openly, and several neighbors stopped by expressing support and sharing their own harassment stories. Even former allies began distancing themselves as rumors circulated. My cows, unaware of human drama, continued enjoying their mud paradise. I'd settled into comfortable routines, feeding them twice daily, and there was something satisfying about the simple rhythm of livestock care. The smell had become less noticeable, and their gentle lowing provided peaceful morning soundtrack. Tuesday evening arrived with crisp autumn air that carried sounds. Farther than usual, the HOA meeting was in the community center, a building Brianna had redecorated with sophisticated furnishings, probably using embezzled funds for tasteful beige carpet and generic paintings. I arrived early with a folder of financial Evidence the room was fuller than ever with 40 residents packed into space for 20 word had gotten out. This wouldn't be routine business about landscaping and mailboxes. Brianna entered exactly at 7, dressed in her most expensive suit and carrying her perfect neighborhood standards, binder like a religious artifact she'd spent extra time on hair, and makeup moving with forced confidence of someone walking into hostile territory. Ladies and gentlemen, she began with that imperious tone, I want to address rumors about HOA finances as your elected president. I take fiscal responsibility seriously and am prepared to answer legitimate questions. I stood up, holding the evidence folder. I have some questions, I said. Clearly the room fell silent as eyes turned to me, then back to Brianna, who suddenly looked less confident. Mr. Simmons, she said, voice higher than usual, I'm sure concerns can be addressed through proper channels. This meeting is for legitimate business, not personal vendettas. Embezzlement is legitimate business, I said, opening my folder and pulling out bank statements. Can you explain why the HOA paid $15,000 to a law firm that says they never worked for us, or why community funds paid for your spa treatments and vacation trips? The room erupted in angry voices as neighbors shouted questions and demands. Brianna tried maintaining control, banging her gavel, but it was too late. Thomas stood confirming several board members had been investigating irregularities. Others pointed out the pond sale happened without proper notification. These are lies, Brianna said, voice cracking as she realized how quickly things spiraled. Mr. Simmons is making false accusations because he's angry about boat violations. This is his vendetta against me. But numbers didn't lie, and the paper trail was impossible to dismiss when I read bank statements aloud detailing thousands in suspicious charges. Even loyal supporters shifted uncomfortably. Spa treatments alone totaled $8,000 charged during months. The association supposedly struggled with basic costs. The final blow came when Tina stood up, identifying herself as an investigative journalist researching regional HOA corruption. Mrs. Whitaker, she said, voice cutting. Through chaos, I have documentation showing you created a shell company using the HOA's tax ID to funnel money into personal accounts. Care to comment before I publish? Brianna's composure shattered. She clutched her binder and looked around desperately, seeing only hostile faces. This is conspiracy, she shrieked. You're working together to destroy me because you're jealous of what I've accomplished. The meeting devolved into chaos with neighbors shouting while Brianna tried regaining control. Finally, someone called for a no-confident vote, which passed 37-3. She was officially removed as HOA president, effective immediately as the meeting erupted in cheers and shouts. A palpable shift occurred in the room. Faces previously etched with fear or resignation now shone with a newfound sense of liberation. Neighbors who had endured Brianna's petty tyrannies for years embraced each other, a collective weight seemingly lifted. I saw old Mr. Henderson give Thomas a firm handshake, their silent acknowledgement speaking volumes. Brianna, now stripped of her power, was a figure of pathetic defiance rather than a queen. Her once impeccable facade crumbled, revealing the raw fear beneath. Seeing her cowering, a strange mix of triumph and emptiness washed over me. It wasn't the fiery vengeance I had perhaps anticipated, but a quiet, profound victory. Justice wasn't just about her fall, it was about the community reclaiming its peace. Walking back that night under the vast starred sky, the gentle lowing of my cows across the water felt less like a sound and more like a lullaby of freedom, a promise that true harmony was finally settling over Lake. Harmony. Rihanna's downfall was swift and decisive. Within a week, the association hired a forensics Accountant to audit their books. The preliminary report confirmed our suspicions she'd embezzled over $20, $0 in 18 months. Criminal charges followed quickly. The county prosecutor filed formal charges of embezzlement fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Brianna's mugshot appeared in the local newspaper, a far cry from her polished campaign photos. But real satisfaction came from watching the neighborhood transform the new HOA board, led by Thomas, and neighbors who'd opposed Brianna's methods immediately rescinded punitive fines and dropped harassment campaigns they also lowered monthly. Dues 30% no longer funding one person's luxury lifestyle, my cattle operation became a permanent and popular community feature. Initial outrage over smell and noise faded as people got used to livestock neighbors. Several families brought children. To watch cows and learn about farm animals, I'd caught Thomas sneaking them treats more than once. The story attracted national attention as an example of creative problem-solving in property disputes. I did more interviews emphasizing this hadn't been about revenge, but standing up to harassment and protecting property rights. Whether people believe that or not, I'd achieved something important, proving HOA tyrants could be beaten if you fought back intelligently. 3 months later, Brad Whitaker visited unexpectedly. Brianna's husband looked haggarded and embarrassed, aged significantly from stress. "Mr. Simmons," he said awkwardly, "I wanted to apologize for everything I knew. Brianna was getting carried away with HOA stuff, but I had no idea about financial irregularities. I've been going through our accounts with forensic accountants, trying to figure out where stolen money went." I invited him for coffee. Brianna had hidden embezzlement from him too, using separate accounts he'd assumed were for legitimate HOA business. He'd only discovered the truth when the forensic accountant presented findings. "She's negotiating a plea bargain," Brad said, staring into his coffee. "Prosecutor wants full restitution, 6 months county jail, 5 years probation with community service. Her lawyer thinks it's the best deal. Considering the money involved, I felt brief. Vindication followed by strange anticlimax. I'd imagined her downfall would feel more satisfying, but watching her husband struggle with wreckage just felt tragic. Justice is supposed to feel righteous, but sometimes it just feels necessary. The final twist came 6 months later with a certified letter from an environmental law firm. A conservation group had been monitoring my operation and wanted to offer a contract to expand it as part of wetland restoration. Your innovative cattle land management has attracted attention from conservation organizations. The letter explained the controlled grazing and wallowing have actually improved the local ecosystem, creating habitat for birds and amphibians that had disappeared due to overdevelopment. The transformation of the former HOA pond wasn't just a local success, it became a beacon of sustainable land management, drawing attention from across the state. My cattle, once symbols of defiance, were now celebrated as partners in ecological restoration, their natural instincts helping to revitalize the wetland. The irony deepened daily. Brianna's misguided pursuit of perfection had unwittingly paved the way for genuine organic beauty during the opening of the Harmony Heights wetland restoration. Demonstration site watching children, wide-eyed with wonder, observed the great blue here and waiting among the cattails. I realized the full scope of what had transpired. This wasn't just about winning a fight, it was about cultivating something far more valuable. It was about showing that even acts rooted in frustration could blossom into unexpected benefits, proving that nature, when given a chance, could reclaim its rightful place, bringing a deeper, more authentic harmony to our community. The new HOA board offered me community president position, but I declined. I had achieved everything I'd set out to do, stood up to systematic bullying, protected property rights, exposed corruption, and accidentally created something positive more. Importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting creative, as sun set over Lake Harmony. That evening, painting water the same gold that originally attracted me here, I sat on my deck listening to evening sounds. From my expanded wetland, cattle were settling for night, their gentle lowing mixing with calls of birds and frogs that had returned since we'd created new habitat. My phone buzzed with the text from Tina, finishing a book about HOA corruption, using my story as a case study. "Any regrets about starting this whole mess?" she asked. I looked at the thriving wetland ecosystem where a great blue heron waded through shallows while my cows rested peacefully, and thought about Brianna probably serving community service. Did I regret standing up to a bully? Did I regret turning her symbol of suburban control into a thriving ecosystem? Did I regret proving creative resistance could be more effective than legal battles? Not a single regret. I texted back, "Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to change the rules entirely." 2 years later, I received a wedding invitation that made me laugh with pure joy. Thomas was marrying another neighbor, and they wanted their ceremony at the Harmony Heights wetland site surrounded by cattle that started this adventure. We figured it was appropriate. Thomas explained this place brought our community together in ways 20 years of HOA meetings never could. I accepted enthusiastically and spent their wedding morning watching cattle pose photogenically while Thomas and his bride exchanged vows by water's edge. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A love story celebrated where suburban conformity once reigned. As reception wound down and guests departed, I found myself alone with my cows again, listening to evening wetland sounds and reflecting on the strange journey I'd bought. A lake cabin seeking peace and quiet, instead finding myself in a war that transformed not just my life, but an entire community's. Understanding of power and what's worth fighting for. The moral, if there is one, might be that sometimes the best way to deal with authority abuse is taking away what they value most and turning it into something better. Or maybe it's simpler. When someone tries bullying you into submission, the most effective response isn't submission or fighting back with same tactics, but buying their pond and filling it with cows. So what do you think should